Thanks, everybody. I just want to mention briefly about focusing on this question about embedding and institutionalisation. Two quite long words, both sound a bit academic, but I think they're really important to us. Before I go on to that, I just want to make a quick advert for the Knowledge Network. I think most of you probably know about it. If you're not members already, it's an open, lots of people don't realise that anyone can join, and so please pass on to colleagues, etc. And I just wanted to advertise the fact that some of you were doing a workshop with Pete and really got a lot out of it. He's actually running an online workshop. For those of you who didn't go to his workshop on what do we do with, how should we support participants after assemblies. He's going to be doing a workshop in 2 weeks' time. We've then got a workshop which raises the question about how do we do systems change work within assemblies. So please do join us. It's not as much fun as it is in this room, but it's, it's something, and it's a way we can stay together. I won't tell you about KNOCA. So I actually haven't got, I was going to say I haven't got a huge amount to say. I always have a huge amount to say. But I haven't got a lot of insight for you on this particular topic. But it's a topic which we don't talk about enough. Well, when we talk about it as, oh, God, we did that assembly and then it didn't go anywhere, or that we did that assembly and the administration didn't respond, or whatever the problem is. So we have plenty of evidence, as I say on there, lots and lots of really good evidence about how to engage citizens well in assemblies. We have some debates about how we should do it. What's the best form of recruitment? What's the best form of evidence provision? What's the best form of governance? These things are up for debate. But we know that when we bring citizens into these spaces, we can do really fabulous things and do really creative stuff. And we can actually generate some really interesting and progressive and sort of, challenging proposals from them. But what we haven't done enough work on is what happens afterwards. We as a community, I think, have a problem. We've focused almost all of our attention on the citizens and not enough on what happens after that. So I think it's fair to say that most assemblies have been responded to poorly. Not all, but most have been responded to poorly by the organisation that's either commissioned them or which is being the target for receiving those recommendations. And just a caveat here, from conversations I've also realised I'm focusing here very much on those assemblies that are focused on affecting policy. I recognise that we may be running assemblies for other reasons, but in this particular session, my focus is mostly on public authorities and other stakeholders receiving. So my question, I guess, the starting question is why have we got a problem here? Which is that often these things don't fit well with the policy cycles, that actually they don't fit with where the public administration is at that particular moment in time. The second one, I think we should name it, which is that sometimes these things are run and people don't care. They actually have no political will. They don't have the ambition of integrating them. And the final one is, I think there's a lack of work on our side of preparing the public administration for what's coming. So I think we actually have some responsibility here as practitioners and or as public officials or as advocates of thinking that we've got the assembly and that's enough. So we haven't put into place, or we haven't worked with public officials, or with public officials you haven't worked enough on the process by which these assembly recommendations are going to be considered within the authority and the way that process is going to be monitored. And as someone said, one of the problems is here, frequently those recommendations cross policy silos. So we're very used to government working in those siloed ways, and suddenly we've got different parts of government being asked to do things which they may never have heard about. There was an example in Scotland, well, no, maybe, I'm not sure if it was Scotland, but someone from Scotland was telling me the story of someone actually landing a recommendation on their desk to change their work pattern, and they'd never even heard of the assembly that was recommending it. So, how that's going to work, I don't know. One of the issues here is I think there are three logics going on. We've got one logic, which is the logic of public governance. And this is the logic that civil servants and administrators work on, which is, there's a whole pattern of work that's been developed for them. There are various rules they've got to follow. There are various directives they've been given by political leadership. And there is a structure of their work. And there is also a set of expectations within their department about what they're going to do and how they're going to deliver it. So there's that kind of logic within public governance about what the pattern of work is. The second is an electoral dynamics, which is that you get party changes, you get kind of like, you get changes of political mandate, and that's at that much more political level. And then we've got this kind of logic of deliberative democracy that comes into that, which doesn't align with the sort of standard way of public administrators doing things and the way that as Kelly said, the way that they generally get evidence. This is a completely different input into their process. And it doesn't have the kind of mandatory force that elections have. It's a kind of different dynamic. This is an input from citizens who have spent time working on these things. And the thought here is, it's taken us tens of decades to actually figure out how bureaucracy and bureaucracy and politics works together. Bureaucracy and electoral politics works together. It's taken a lot of time to figure that out, and suddenly we're trying to put this new input into those processes where they have very different logics. So what do you think needs to be in place from the positions that you're sitting in, many of you from public authorities who have actually run these processes and other people are thinking about them? What do you think needs to be in place to better embed those recommendations within decision making? So what structures and processes do you think need to be in place within the administration? What structures and processes would you like to see around the Assembly and around the administration to make sure to monitor that process? And there are a bunch of different actors involved here when an Assembly is going to make its recommendations, who could have a role in that process of either making sure that things are considered or monitoring. And within that, we can think about there being politicians, people with a political mandate. We can think of the civil servants, and we can think of two types of civil servants here. One, the civil servants who are organising it, but also the civil servants who then might have to deliver. We've got a bunch of stakeholders around that process, whether they're environmental NGOs or other kind of businesses or whatever. And then we've got the citizens themselves who are part of the process. So we've kind of got like at least 4 sets of actors: politicians, civil servants, the stakeholders around it, and the members themselves. So I'm just going to introduce sort of 3. I don't think these are no way are they the end of the conversation. They're starting the conversation about 3 places where I've seen them try to deal with this in different ways. The first is what I'm calling the Irish model, but it can also be, so these are 2 of these are from national level, but they translate to local level as well. And what they do in Ireland is they have the Citizens' Assembly. The citizens make their recommendations, and rather than those recommendations going straight to government, they create a special committee of the Parliament, or the equivalent would be a special committee of the Council that reviews the recommendations of the Assembly. So it gets embedded within the political sphere. And that a committee is then responsible for sending a report, and this is a committee that is a cross-party committee, as you would have in most, and that committee has then sent a report with its recommendations based on what it's heard to the political executive. And the argument is that this buys in Parliament, buys in the council body, and then and that has much more standing within the executive than something that would just come from citizens. So you've got, if you like, someone was using the word political translation. And in a sense, this is translating the Assembly into the political system through a council committee or through a parliamentary committee. The only problem with this is that this is a very cool place for special interests to sort of start their process. So in Ireland, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in Ireland, as I understand it, almost all of the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly that dealt with climate made it through to the Irish bill, apart from the 1 or 2 recommendations that recommended action on farming, because the farming lobby was so strong that it was able to affect this ministry. So they lost out of 14 recommendations, they lost 1 or 2 recommendations, but the others, because that committee, so there's a danger here. And one of the things that's really interesting is this committee doesn't need to say anything to the Assembly. I think actually there's a missed opportunity. If you could have had the Assembly reviewing what they said, but this is really interesting and actually, as I say, locks in the Parliament or locks in the Council. So that's, I think, one interesting model. But it does, there is this kind of moment. And just as an aside, from what I understand it from hearing from various people, the reason why the Irish ran a new assembly on biodiversity loss was to try and deal with the farmers. So they kind of like, they tried this process once, didn't deal with the farming issue, are running another citizens' assembly, calling it biodiversity, not those bloody farmers, and kind of trying to deal with it that way. And I think what's interesting, and again, with the Irish one, with the Climate Assembly, it only had 14 recommendations, and that's quite easy to deal with. I think the new one has got 68, 70 recommendations, maybe even more than that, and we've never seen a committee deal with 68 recommendations, and so there's much more opportunity there for cherry picking, for choosing those ones that they particularly like. Anyway, that's one model, and what that does is it brings Parliament into it brings the Council into it. It's not just a relationship between the Assembly and the Executive. You've actually brought the elected representatives into the process as well, not just the ministers. So that's one kind of simple model. The second one is the Scottish model. The Scottish model is a bit more complicated, but I think is really interesting. The first thing is about Scotland. I haven't got all the details here, and Kelly can tell you way more about Scotland than anyone needs to know. But we have people in the room who were there. The first thing to say is that they created a secretariat, and the secretariat was public officials who were seconded from their normal job to actually support the running of the Assembly. They didn't run the Assembly, but they were kind of the secretariat for it. They made sure they appointed Kelly and her colleagues, they put together the expert leads, they played a very important coordination role. Now, for some people, they feel that meant it compromised the independence. But what it did was it locked civil servants in from the start of the process, who became champions for that process. So it's a trade-off, but it's a really interesting one. And they created governance structures, and Lise is going to come, hopefully she's going to come tearing in a minute from her train, and she's going to talk to us about governance. But one of the things they did was in the stewarding group, with their advisory group, they made sure all the different political parties were there, they made sure all the major sectoral interests were there, and they were there from the start. So they knew what was going on. So these key actors were there, and I think that was really critical, very early on, of getting buy-in. When the Assembly was happening, the Secretariat started having meetings with all the as they were seeing what the Assembly was talking about, they started to say, oh yeah, that will affect that civil servant, that will affect that department. And they started arranging meetings with them to make sure they knew that the Assembly was happening. They did outreach to the particular administrators who they could see would be affected. And that was really critical for raising awareness. And at the same time, they created what we call a sponsoring team, which was a team of civil servants who were going to be responsible for taking the recommendations and working with them. And that was a small team within the climate department. I think at one point it got up to about 4 or 5 members, but it's kind of like a small team of civil servants who were going to be charged with responsibility of taking those recommendations forward. The government had promised that it would respond within 6 months to those recommendations, which is important. So once the recommendations were made, you had this sponsoring team actually go out to every single part of the administration where those recommendations were, explaining the process. They'd already talked to them before, and saying, we need you to respond in the following kind of way to this over the next few months. So you had a team of civil servants who actually took that responsibility. You're all captivated by bureaucracy, aren't you? I can tell. And at the same time as they were doing that, Assembly members had been trained up by the Secretariat to talk to some of the MSPs, some of the political representatives who are going to have to decide as to whether to take this forward or not, and to talk to some of the civil servants. So they did that training, and so they were, again, raising awareness amongst the higher levels of politics, and it was the citizens who were doing that. And those citizens, as Pete will tell you, had to be trained. They couldn't just go into the room. They'd done an assembly. Doesn't mean you can now go into a room with a politician and be able to know what to do. Because politicians have a fabulous way of turning conversations, etc. So they were capacity building. So then the government published its recommendations. And what the organisers had decided, and I think they got enough budget for this, was to actually reconvene the Citizens' Assembly at that point. So we had this fantastic process where for 6 months, the whole administration was being guided by this sponsoring team. They created a very, very good set of government responses compared to other responses. And then they reconvened the Assembly to review what the government had said. And the Assembly said, nah, You haven't really got it. You've kind of picked some of the stuff up, but you really haven't understood that we're talking about quite large change. So there was an interaction here between the assembly and the politicians and the administration. At which point you would hope that then the sponsoring team would carry on doing its work. Unfortunately, that's where Scotland ended. There was nobody. Whoa. That would have been interesting. That would have been a really good GIF. There was no. What they put all their focus on. We have to respond within 6 months. We have to set the administration up to respond within 6 months, and no one had thought what happens after 6 months. Because that's what the administrators and the politicians were so focused on that moment. And really, you can't really blame the sponsoring team. They were told to do other things at that point. But that sponsoring team, this should then have carried on. What I think was, up to this point, this was amazing. Personally, I think this is the best response I've seen within an administration to anything. But it also gives you an idea of, sometimes you can create these moments where you think, isn't this fantastic that we've got this assembly back? But then you haven't designed the next bit. And in Scotland, it's still alive, but it's not alive in the same way. So myself and Kelly and a few other people met with administrators recently, and they're really disappointed about what happened, but they're really disappointed that they hadn't spotted that this was going to be a problem. They kind of thought everything would have been sorted within 6 months. 6 months isn't enough. This needs to be kept alive for a year, 2 years, etc. But I think it's a really good example of what you can do and what different actors can do. And then the final example I want to give you is the Brussels model. And this is a bit different because this is, I was talking about using these words, embedding. So I think these are examples of how you embed an assembly within our political and administrative processes. Embedding means we've actually taken it seriously. We've got processes and structures in place. But this one is embedding and institutionalization, a bit like Milan. They've decided that they want to have an assembly that has a more permanent status. And so what they do is they've got assembly with the governance model, a governance body is a bit like Scotland. And then that assembly produces its report. And the administration is required, I think, you've got me right here, I think it's required to respond within 3 months, and I think 9 months, and then maybe a bit later than that as well. There's kind of like, not just one, but there's kind of like, and actually it's good because in 3 months they can just say, these are the sorts of things we're thinking of doing, rather than trying to do everything. 9 months they can report again, but there are reporting moments. And what they do is exactly what Rudy was saying. They select, out of that assembly, they select a small group of members who are the monitoring committee, who actually are trained to engage with the administration and can actually follow that process through. And the other thing they do, and I think I'll just tell you this, is though the people who are in the first assembly, they get to select the question for the next assembly. But that's an aside. I just thought that you might be interested in that this is where, how do we get them? Because they've been through an assembly process and they know the sort of questions that will work. And then there is this regular reporting, and you've got a cycle going. You've got a new assembly, but you've got the old assembly members checking up on what was happening in the previous one. One danger of this process, and we've come across this in Belgium, is that if you have too many assemblies going on, suddenly the administrators are overwhelmed with recommendations. So sometimes you have to think about trying to control the number of recommendations that come out of this. But this is a sort of institutionalization model. So my takeaway, I've got two takeaway slides here. Finally, they are actually here, which is great. The first is I think we need to think about embedding, and this is what I've been talking about most of the time. And this is about, in the same way that we design we spend so much time designing the structures and processes of our citizens' assembly, we need to become experts in designing the structures and processes that surround the assembly. And that we have to understand that these things need to be embedded. In some political contexts, we don't want to embed them because actually politics is so problematic and we need to do these things independently. But for most of us, we're doing work which is commissioned by government or which is focused on government, and it's not enough just to run the assembly. However cool that bit is and how much fun that bit is, we've actually got to spend time thinking about bureaucracy and thinking about political actors. And we need to think about embedding. And I guess we also need to start thinking about institutionalization because of what's happening in Milan, what's happening in Brussels is, can we make this more of a permanent part of our infrastructure? Now, you would think that if you institutionalized, everything would be fine. But you could institutionalize without embedding. You could have it going on every year and it does nothing. So we need to do both of those things. We need to make sure that just because you've succeeded in getting a permanent assembly doesn't mean anything's going to happen. It means we've actually still got to do a lot of that embedding work. So, for me, we need to carefully consider the roles of these different actors. The three models I've shown you are all different from each other. They could be, you know, it may be that in your particular context, a different structure of institutions or different processes are needed, but we need to carefully consider what the roles of these different actors might be in that embedding process. And this is a call. I mean, the people who know me know that, you know, I love the citizen engagement bit. And I actually, my first job, and I was telling a couple of people about this last night, my first job back in 1992, which ages me, I worked for Nottinghamshire County Council, so a big council in the UK. And they delivered, Agenda 21 had happened, this big kind of like Rio Earth Summit had happened, and there was directions to local authorities to do public engagement. And I did it really, really badly. I had no idea what I was doing. One of the reasons I do this work, I think, is I was traumatized by this year of doing public engagement in Nottinghamshire. But what really struck me was that I then spent the next 20 years, 25 years of my life thinking about how do you do public engagement better. And that's what I've been doing all that time, is how do you make the experience of citizens better? And I've realized that I have to go back to the bureaucracy, and that actually we can do some really cool work. But if we don't get the bureaucracy right, if we don't get the link into the political system right, then actually our work is almost meaningless. On that negative note or positive note, so it's a call for us to start thinking about this process. So thank you very much.
Okay.